Lesson 12. Some nouns can be masculine or feminine. You can refer to them as common gender, but it's not an important point or an important point of jargon. There are 3 examples I can provide to you: sacerdos, sacerdotis, all of them third declensions. It also happens in other declensions, for example, amicus or amica. You can have the word friend be masculine or the word friend be feminine, obviously. But in the examples given in this chapter, sacerdos, sacerdotis, custos, custodes, conjunx, and conjugus, they're all third declensions, and they have a single form for either the masculine or the feminine. It just depends on whether the priest, for example, in sacerdos, is a male or a female. A guard or guardian can be male or female, and a conjunx, a spouse, can be male or female. So that's a minor thing to look for, that these words can be either masculine or feminine, and that will matter when you're looking for the adjective that modifies it. So if you're assuming that the priest is masculine, but you can't find a masculine adjective in the sentence, reconsider, and perhaps the priest is feminine. It's a minor point. It probably will not come up too much in the study in this chapter or elsewhere. Much more important is the third declension neuter nouns. So last time you learned the masculine and feminine third declension nouns. Now you're going to be learning the third declension neuter gender. It's only small differences between what you learn for a masculine. The masculine example or the feminine example are always the same. Here is a example that happens to be masculine, and you'll see that the endings here correspond in almost every single example with the neuter. Nomen and rex are the nominative singular, and they're unpredictable. You have to look them up or memorize them. Nominative singular, you cannot tell the difference. Now it gets more predictable. Nominus and regis both end in is. You find the stem by taking the genitive, nomen, or regis, and dropping the is, and that's the form, that's the stem that you use for all other declensions except for the nominative singular. The rest of the word, the rest of the noun, uses the genitive minus the is as the stem. Nomini for the dative ends with an I, just like regi ends with an I. Nomen, the accusative, is the same as the nominative singular. Every single neuter in the Latin language follows this pattern. The nominative in the neuter equals the accusative every single time for a neuter gender noun. Neuters have the same nominative and the same accusative. Regem does not have the same nominative and accusative because it is not a neuter. So regem does not match up. Then when you go to the plural, you have another difference. The plural of rex is reges. In the neuter, it ends with an A. But you've also seen that for a second declension word like templum. The nominative plural of templum is templa. There's another easy pattern to remember. Just like in English, bacterium becomes bacteria, so templum in the neuter becomes templa in the plural, and nomen in the singular becomes nomina with an A in the plural. Naturally, the accusative has the exact same form, because in all neuters, the accusative and the nominative equal each other, singular and plural. Then the next one you have is nominum, just like regum. Then nominibus, just like regibus. The accusative we've already seen is the exact same as the nominative. And then you get down to nominibus again, just like regibus. So no surprises, really, when you learn the neuter. The only issue that you have, perhaps, in learning the neuter is that the nominative and accusative are the same, and that's it. I know it sounded like I was going to say something else, but the pattern is really just the same. The neuter shows very little difference in comparison with the masculine and feminine. The only difference that you have to be worry about is the nomina, and the nomen, but that's just because the nominatives and accusatives are always the same. Now at this point, this is the hardest lesson you've learned so far. It's a little premature to introduce it if you ask me, but it's in the book here, so we have to go into it. You're going to learn what I would refer to as indirect statement. The book only gives you one verb to use so far, but this can be used with a number of different verbs. Indirect statement is a type of complex sentence. There's only about 12 or 13, at the most, maybe 14 of these complex sentences in all of Latin to learn. The numbering varies on how you want to divide them up. The way I do it, there's about 13 different kinds of complex sentence, and this is the first type that you'll learn. There's a very clear formula for what complex sentences have. What complex sentences have in their formula is a main clause and a subordinate clause. This is the most important thing that you have to understand for the rest of the year in learning Latin. There is a main clause, and it is joined to one or more subordinate clauses. You can call it a secondary clause or a dependent clause. In this case, you could call it a clause of indirect statement. It doesn't really matter. I'm going to use the formula main clause plus subordinate clause. Understand this now, and the rest of the year should go very smoothly, as well as the second semester. And what's interesting in Latin, or what you have to realize, is that very often strange things that you wouldn't expect happen in the subordinate clause. For example, an indirect statement happens in the subordinate clause when you have a verb of saying, a verb of knowing, a verb of thinking, a verb of perceiving, or a verb of feeling in the main clause. So if the main clause has any one of these types of verbs, for example, I say that she is pretty, or I know that she is pretty, or I think she is pretty, I perceive that she is beautiful, I feel that she is beautiful. Any verb related to saying, knowing, thinking, perceiving, or feeling. For example, perceiving could be, I think or I see that she is very beautiful. Any verb. I hear that she is the prettiest girl in the school. Any of those verbs related to saying, knowing, thinking, perceiving, or feeling trigger an indirect statement clause. The verb of saying, knowing, thinking, or perceiving is going to be in the main clause. Now here's what's strange about it. After this verb of saying, knowing, thinking, perceiving, or feeling in the main clause, there's going to be two strange things that happen. Any nominatives that happen after the main clause, or any nominatives that are not in the main clause, that is to say, doesn't necessarily have to happen after. That's the normal way for it to happen, but any nominative that is in the subordinate clause is going to change into an accusative. So nominatives in the subordinate clause change to accusatives, but the accusative in the subordinate clause is still treated as the subject. The second weird thing that happens, any verb that happens after the main clause, or any verb that is in the subordinate clause, because the word order doesn't really matter. Any verb that happens in the subordinate clause changes into the infinitive. Sorry, I wrote the accusative right there. Any verb that happens outside of the main clause is going to be changed into the infinitive, but is still going to be translated, usually, as if it were an indicative. The book starts you out with a very easy example of the verb video, which means I see. That's a verb of saying, knowing, thinking, perceiving, or feeling. In particular, it's a verb of perceiving something. Now, all the words I just said might not have helped you very much. It might still be confusing to you. The examples put together with my words will make it understandable. Here's the first example. Video, there's your main clause. I see. Here's your subordinate clause. Deus appropinquare. Video is the main clause. It means I see. Deus appropinquare is the subordinate clause, and it means the gods are approaching. If you put that all together, you would translate it as something like, I see, and the word that is not there in the Latin, I see the gods are approaching, or I see that the gods are approaching. That's easy for me to translate here, but what's funny about it is gods is in the accusative, just like I said up here, number 1. It should be a nominative because the gods are the one doing the approaching, but it gets changed into the accusative after the verb video, and appropinquare is number 2. The verb changes into the infinitive. So appropinquare is the infinitive present active, and yet I've translated it not as an infinitive. I've translated it as if it were an indicative. I said that I see that the gods are approaching. If I were to translate it literally, it would sound funny. It would say, I see the gods to approach. It doesn't make sense in English. Please don't translate it like that. Here's another example. The word order, by the way, does not matter. The word order does not matter. I could put that same sentence in this format. Video, there's your main clause. It still says, I see, that's your main clause, even though in Latin it comes at the end. In English it doesn't work that way. I see that the gods in the accusative are approaching in the infinitive. Deus should be in the nominative, and appropinquare should be in the indicative. But after a verb like I perceive or I see, the verb turns into the infinitive, and the nominative changes into the accusative. Here's another example. Remember, word order doesn't matter. Video, I see, the men in the accusative are doubting in the infinitive. To put it into smooth and natural sounding English, you would just say, I see the men are doubting. Or I see that the men are doubting. There's no word for that in Latin, but I put it in there because it might sound a little smoother or better to you. Look at the next example. Videt fondera conjugem, taken right from Ovid, about a story about a man seeing his wife turning into a tree. It says, he sees, that's your main clause. It's a verb of perceiving. He sees that his wife, conjugem, in the accusative, is sprouting, or is sprouting leaves, or is growing leaves, however you want to translate fondera. But to make it simple, it says, he sees, main clause, his wife is sprouting. Even though wife is in the accusative, I'm using it as a nominative, and even though is sprouting is in the infinitive, I'm translating it as if it were an indicative. Look at the next one. They see, that's your main clause. I got to autocorrect here. It should be the Dios in the accusative for gods. They see that the gods are strangers. Even though gods or strangers, if it were not in a subordinate clause, would be in the nominative, In this sentence, they're both in the accusative. Because anytime you follow a verb like video, which is a verb of perceiving, anytime you follow that verb, your nominatives change into accusative and your verbs change into infinitives. So it says, they see that the strangers are gods. Look at the next example. You see the girl is good. This is the accusative. This is the accusative agreeing with girl. And here's the infinitive. If you translated that as it's written literally in Latin, it would sound funny. It would say, you see the girl to be good. Nobody speaks like that, and nobody writes like that. In Latin, that's how they say it. So when you translate into English, you have to change it a little bit. Look at the last example. You all see the boy runs. The main clause is videtis. And then once you have a verb of perceiving, the rules change in the subordinate clause. And you have to put the nominatives into the accusative, and you have to put the verb into the infinitive. It's one of the trickiest things in Latin. But the book starts you out nice and slow with just one verb to worry about. And it's not a bad idea in the sense that when we actually get to indirect statement as a whole lesson, you'll already be familiar with it. It's one of the harder lessons for students to understand, so this is a good way to ease you into it. Let me review the rules with you one more time. You'll see this pattern all over the place in Latin. A main clause plus some kind of subordinate clause. In this case, the main clause has a verb like video. You can reverse the order of these two clauses and write the subordinate clause first and the main clause second, but it doesn't matter. The main clause is still the most important part. Whether the main clause comes first or second, it still dictates what happens in the subordinate clause. And that makes sense because the subordinate clause is subordinated to the main clause. It's dependent upon the main clause. So in this kind of main clause and subordinate clause relationship, once you have a verb like video, the subordinate clause, whether it comes first or second, has to have its verb in the infinitive. So far, you know the infinitive present active. For example, you have the infinitive present active amare. And the nouns that would normally be in the nominative have to be put in the accusative. So, in this example, it says, I see that the girls love, and then I'd have to put another object of that love. I see that the girls love eum. I see that the girls love him. It's a complicated way to express yourself in Latin, but you actually kind of do this sometimes in English. You'll see when we get to the full lesson on indirect statement. But here's a little preview of it. In English, you could say something like, I find her, which is the accusative, to be smart. Here's the infinitive in English. Here's the accusative in English. Here's a verb of saying, knowing, thinking, or perceiving. So far, you just have the verb video. I see her to be smart. Sounds silly in English, so don't translate it like that. You would say something like, I see that she is smart. You finally get into the third conjugation of verb, and all you really learn about the third conjugation of verb so far is what it looks like in the dictionary. Most normal verbs have four principal parts. The first principal part, the second principal part. I don't bother to write out the third and fourth here because it's not really relevant to what I'm talking about. But you can see that in the first conjugation of verb, the second principal part ends in are. In the second conjugation, the second principal part ends in ere, and it's a long ere. Now, if the long mark isn't there, you can also see that the first principal part ends in eo. So you don't even need the long mark. And like I've mentioned to you before, if you ever read real Latin or look at a real Latin text or inscription, it won't have any long marks to help you. The way you would know is because you memorized it or because you can look at the principal parts. The book introduces to you that the third conjugation also ends in ere, but it's a short ere. And again, if you don't have long and short marks to help you, you know that these two declensions are different because, I should have said conjugation. Anyway, you know that these two conjugations are different because the first principal part ends with O, and then the second principal part has ere. And the first principal part up here ends in EO, and then ERA. So you don't need long marks. All you need to know is the first conjugation ends with an O and then an ARE. Second conjugation ends with an EO and then an ERE. And third conjugation ends with O and then ERE. That's how you tell those three conjugations apart. That's an important skill so that you can use the dictionary easily and properly. The imperatives nolla and nollita are introduced. Nolla is the imperative, that's the mood, it's for commands. Present tense, active voice, second person singular, you singular. That word translates as do not, and you complete the idea of not doing something with an infinitive. If those words don't make sense to you, you'll understand it with an example. Nollita is the imperative present active second person plural. Obviously, it too means do not, and you complete the idea with the infinitive. So here's an example that'll show you how you work it. Nolla, second person singular, imperative present active, completed with an infinitive. It says, do not fear. That's not how you would literally translate the Latin, but that's how it sounds good in English. So when you see nolla plus an infinitive, translated as do not, and whatever the infinitive means. Do not, in this example, fear. Here's the plural. Do not fear. This is for you, singular. This is for you, plural. Hey, y'all, don't fear. And here's one more example. Nolla I can't do that word today. Nolla appropinquare. It says, do not approach. And that is the singular, so it's, hey, you, singular, do not approach. This word is in the infinitive, this is in the infinitive, and this is in the infinitive. Pretty simple to use word. The substantive adjective is a concept and a term that is used frequently in Latin. Just like in English, sometimes adjectives can be used as nouns. For example, only the good die young. Only the good what? Only the good people, only the good men, only the good horses. You don't specify in English, you just use the adjective good. There's no noun in that sentence. Only the good die young. Or the meek shall inherit the earth. The meek people, do you mean? Or do you mean the meek women, or the meek men, the meek children? It doesn't specify a noun, but it still makes sense in English. The adjective is used as a noun. The adjective is used as a substance. And then you have this example, only the strong survive. Again, you don't specify only the strong monkeys, only the strong children survive. There's no specific noun. You just have to understand from context what the person is talking about. Only the strong people survive might be a good addition to that. But the adjective by itself makes perfect sense in English and in Latin. Now in Latin, the gender helps provide a sense of which noun itself is being used. For example, if you say boni, that means the good, possibly men, because it's masculine, or possibly boys. It could also mean a group of people, because when you have a group, you default to the masculine if you have even one male in that group. Many Romance languages do that. I think they all do. So it definitely does not mean the good women, but it could mean the men, the boys, the people, anything masculine, because bony itself is masculine. If you have bone-I, on the other hand, that definitely means the good women, girls, or something else feminine. Could be anything feminine. And for example, again, if you have PE, that means the dutiful people. It could be men, boys, or people, but it is not a group of only women, because that is a masculine plural adjective. It's a masculine plural adjective. It can refer to boys, men, or a group of people that are mixed in gender, but it is not solely women. Any of these adjectives can be used as substantive adjectives, or any adjective in the Latin language can be used as a substantive adjective to represent nouns, just like you can say the same kind of thing in English. One more very important lesson is the conjugation of the indicative pluperfect active verb. In this case, you take the third principal part, amo, amari, amawi. This is the same principal part you use to do the perfect tense. So you take the third principal part only. I didn't bother writing out the fourth principal part. You take that third principal part and then you drop the I, just like you did to form the perfect. So I had amawi, now I just have amav. And then you add eram, eras, erat, eramis, eratis, erant. So it'd be emaweram, amaweras, amawerat, etc. Amaweramos. And the translation of this verb form, you have to have the word had in there. For example, this is I had loved. That distinguishes it from the perfect, which would say either I loved or I have loved. The pluperfect has to use had, not have, before loved. If the verb were see, you would say I had seen. If it was lived, you'd say I had lived. Amawarat would mean he, she, or it had loved. Amawaramus, we had loved. So a very simple form to learn. Just 3 easy steps. Take the third principal part, drop the I, and add aram, eras, erat, eramis, eratis, erant. And then you translate that as had, whatever the verb is. And that's it. It's a busy lesson. You learn the first part of indirect statement with the verb video. That's a very important lesson for Latin for future lessons. It's one of the most difficult things to do. You learn the pluperfect, which is really important. You learned about the commonly used substantive adjective. And those are the main points that are from this lesson that will come up probably in all of your readings on a regular basis.